Tokyo, January 1946. Frost grips the window lattice like white veins. In a half-collapsed clinic, wind slips through tar paper and rattles a torn curtain. A kerosene lamp stains the room with honey light. On a cot, an infant fights for breath, small ribs counting the seconds, lips sulking toward blue. A young mother, kimono patched at the elbows, keeps 2 fingers beneath a tiny nostril to feel any whisper of air. She does not blink. Boots stop at the threshold. A U.S. Army nurse, sergeant's stripes dulled by soot, sets down a canvas satchel. The metal clasp clicks and the room tightens. Out comes a glass vial, amber and miraculous. Penicillin. Next, a dented enamel cup, steam faint as prayer. Warm milk sweetened to tempt a mouth that has forgotten hunger. The nurse speaks softly, words landing between languages, then rolls a sleeve, scrubs the crook of a twig-thin arm, and taps a blue thread of vein until it answers. The needle slips. A breath catches. The mother's fist closes on nothing and stays closed. Outside, a hand pump coughs. Coal smoke drifts from a brazier. Somewhere, a bicycle bell rings and a new line forms at a chalkboard that simply reads, "Milk today." The crisis did not end with surrender. It began again with survival. Surrender wrote an armistice on paper. Winter wrote its own terms on skin. Between August and October 1945, Tokyo learned the geometry of ruins. Whole wards had no roofs. Pharmacies were shelves of glass without bottles. Rail lines jittered with boxcars carrying everything and nothing. Coal to keep pot-bellied stoves alive. Sacks of barley that arrived late and thin. Mothers lined for ration cards under a sky that still smelled faintly of burned neighborhoods. Infants lost heat through ribs that showed like fence rails. Coughs lingered. Diarrhea came fast in alleys where water ran brown after rain. Flu numbers climbed a chalkboard that no one wanted to update. The clinic where our story will live had once been a neighborhood pediatric ward. Now it was a patchwork. Tar paper where windows had shattered. Doors rehung on wire. A hand pumped well out back with a bucket chain worn smooth by winter. A tall cabinet survived the fires. Its drawers labeled in a calligrapher's hand, but most were empty. Thermometers lay in cotton unbroken but suddenly precious. Cotton itself was rationed or unraveled from old quilts and boiled clean. The world shrank to essentials and the hours they could be made to keep. Into this shortage stepped 4 people who did not yet know they were a crew. Sergeant Ellen Wade, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, age 27, from a river town that built barges and boiled coffee so strong it could stare back. Dr. Sato Haruko, 34, pediatrician trained in Osaka, sardonic in peace and stone-faced in trouble. Sleeves always rolled because she preferred to wash her own instruments. Miyu, 20, a new mother with a way of holding silence like a blade. She wore a mended kimono and kept her hair tight because loose hair made babies sneeze. And Corporal Reeves, a medic from Nebraska who had learned to carry milk the way other men carried rifles. Upright, steady, the handle biting his palm without shaking the liquid line. Occupation Authority brought plans, officers, and a paper river of directives that took time to find the street. What reached fastest were hands in crates. Trucks rattled up alleys that were not meant for trucks. In their beds, wooden boxes stenciled in black. Penicillin. Powdered milk, fortified. Droppers and syringes, fragile. Coal, emergency. A bilingual corpsman chalked doses on a scrap of blackboard while a neighborhood headwoman collected names and ages, writing with a pencil cut down to a stump. Someone scavenged a kettle and a mesh strainer. Someone else found fire bricks and balanced them into a brazier. The clinic's first new sound since summer was water boiling like applause. The enemy they fought wore no uniform. Pneumonia arrived under the door with night air, sat on chests and pressed until lips turned a color no mother could bear. Dysentery crawled through shared cups and thin hands, hollowing bellies faster than a day could refill them. Cold stole calories. Hunger stole judgment. Exhaustion stole the stubbornness that had carried families through bomb nights. Every dose had to land on time. Every bottle had to be warmed, never scalded, never cool enough to shock a stomach that had learned to be wary of fullness. Trust was a second battlefield. Rumors traveled faster than trucks. Was the needle poison? Would milk curdle a baby's lungs? Was this pity that hid something like shame? Dr. Sato stood in the doorway each morning and stated the clinic's facts in a voice that made facts feel like rules. We weigh, we listen. We warm, we dose, we wait. Ellen did not argue with rumor. She replaced it with ritual. Sleeves rolled the same way, vial held where a mother could see its label. A drop of penicillin tapped on a tongue depressor so the word medicine became a taste. Miyu, who had arrived with her infant wrapped in a faded cloth, learned the rhythm and repeated it for women who stood at the threshold stiff with pride and fear. Reeves learned to make a line behave by loading his fatigue pockets with barley candies and handing one to a brother or sister only when a mother nodded. There were days when the clinic looked like a small factory. The chalkboard became a schedule. 0900 well water boil, 0915 bottle sterilize, 0930 penicillin prep, 0945 first feed, 1000 recheck breaths. Dr. Sato turned triage into lanes. Blue lips lane, fever lane, hungry but strong lane. Ellen measured doses by weight. Then by instinct so practiced it felt like a different kind of scale in her fingers. Reeves decanted milk from army tins into enamel pots and learned the way steam behaves in winter. It walks out of the room unless you trap it with cloth. Miyu wrote times on scraps of paper and tucked them into sleeves because paper is a promise when clocks are scarce. At night the ward belonged to lamps and lullabies. Coal stoves hummed. Mothers drowsed upright with infants on their chests so warmth didn't wander. Ellen slept in her coat, boots unlaced, one ear tuned to the cough that changes pitch when a lung stops fighting. Sato's notes grew sparse and exact. Penicillin given, respirations eased, stool thickened, glass returned unbroken. Reeves learned the map of alleys by kerosene light so he could find the houses that didn't make it to morning cues. Miyu taught 2 other mothers how to mix milk without wasting a drop, counting spoonfuls like prayer beads. Beyond their block, the city adjusted to defeat and ritual in the same breath. Rail workers learned to nudge coal into schedules that honored clinic hours. A printer with half a press and half a typeface offered to run cards that read, Mutozi, Lai Yuan Shijian, mother and child clinic time. A monk from a temple with a new roof carried buckets because he said a bell should earn its ring. And somewhere, in a warehouse where windows were patched with cardboard, a quartermaster checked a ledger and quietly fought for another pallet of penicillin that would go to this address and not be late. This was the edge between surrender and survival. A city learning to breathe on lists and small warmths, a clinic turning strangers into a team by repeating the same 4 actions until fear flickered and lay. Down the next section opens those lists and warmths into a language, the grammar of care written on chalkboards, bottles, and faces that learned to stay. The clinic learned a new language that winter. Not nouns and verbs, but verbs only. Boil, warm, weigh, dose, weight. It began on a chalkboard whose wood frame had been rescued from a school cupboard. Dr. Sato wrote the first sentence in blocky script. Konoki o mamoru ni wa junjo ga iru. To guard a child's breath, we need order. Under it, time slots like rungs, 0630 water on, 0645 bottles in, 7 jur penicillin prep, 715 first Q under 6 months, 8 turn second Q 6-12 months, Taikso follow-ups and reweigh. The board became law because the room believed it before anyone outside did. Supply learned the grammar next. Reeves split the courtyard into lanes with rope soft as old clothesline. Inbound crates here, empties there, coal stacked in a low wall to blunt the wind. He inked a ledger in slow, careful numerals. Milk tins X12, penicillin ampoules X36, syringes X10, glass, luer, and added a column called Chianke, missing because truth kept the clinic sober. When a crate arrived light, he wrote it, not to accuse but to plan. Ellen taped dose cards to the cabinet door with brown paper ribbon, weight in can and kilograms, penicillin in units, milk in ounces and spoonfuls. A parallel arithmetic that let anyone in the room cross the bridge. Miyu taught the line how to wait well. She sat on the threshold, infants stacked across her lap like careful parcels, and murmured a simple rule to each mother in reach. Warm chest, warm bottle, slow mouth. Listen for breath between swallows. She showed how to wrap a hot cloth around a bottle without scalding, how to burp a baby without waking the whole ward, how to lay an infant upright in a sling if coughs turned rough. She drew these things on scrap paper for women who could not read and used colored thread for numbers. 1 knot for 1 spoon, 2 knots for 2. In a week, the doorway became a school whose only fee was attention. Trust entered the building in small disguises. The headwoman brought a carpenter who planed a crooked door so draft stopped cutting the room in half. A rice merchant sent 2 boys with a bucket of AIM syrup for mixing, sweetness that made milk taste like something remembered rather than prescribed. A priest insisted on turning the well handle for an hour each morning to keep the spirits of rust away, which meant, in practice, that a tired mother did not have to pump water before dawn. Ritual collects helpers. There were complications that could have broken fragile confidence. 2 infants reacted to penicillin with rashes like angry snow. Ellen caught the flush early, halted the dose, cooled the skin with cloths, whispered apologies that needed no words, and wrote Guomin, sensitivity, in pencil on each chart. Dr. Sato explained without flinch, "A tiny number of bodies rage at this drug. We listen and choose another path." The mothers watched for evasion and saw none. The clinic's honesty became another kind of medicine. The cold deepened. Coal came late and dusty, as if the mountain had coughed and reluctantly shared its phlegm. Reeves crushed slack into briquettes with a borrowed mold and a rhythm that turned powder to stone. Ellen cannibalized a broken sterilizer. To rig a double pot warmer so the bottles stayed at temperature between feeds, Dr. Sato drew a plan for a draft curtain, a suspended sheet that could be lowered to keep the warm half of the room from bleeding into the cold, then traded a pair of scissors to a tailor for the stitching. Miyu cut rags into neat squares and stacked them like currency beside the heater. They learned to fight time with sequence. On storm days, the queue began by lantern, Blue Lip Lane to the beds nearest heat, Fever Lane to the cots under the lamp, Hungry but Strong Lane to the benches along the wall where Miyu's hands were swiftest. Ellen dosed penicillin on the quarter hour, set a metronome in her head, and spun back to check breathing at the same beats. Reeves marked the stove to show where kettles should sit for a simmer instead of a boil. He taught 2 teenagers to watch for the first beat of steam and call ready in a voice that cut through talk without frightening the babies. Translation turned out to be an instrument. The clinic printed dose tickets on offcuts from a press, small cards stamped with a red fan and the words Mutozi. One side showed a baby's weight grid and circles to fill as ounces went down. The other showed a minimalist map of the ward for nervous fathers who wanted to help but did not know where to start. Dr. Sato wrote 3 phrases in kana so that anyone could read them regardless of schooling. ゆっくり飲ませる feed slowly. ケケが長い時は起こして描く. Wake and hoard when coughs last. 熱が下がったら寝かせる. Let sleep when the fever goes. The cards traveled home in sleeves and returned stained with milk and pencil, proof that routine could pass through walls. By late February, the room sounded different. Coughs still barked, but less like paper tearing. The kettle's applause felt confident. Mothers began arriving 10 minutes early because they wanted the same seat as yesterday. A young father in factory blue showed up with a handmade bottle tree, a drying rack with pegs he had turned from scrap, bowed once and vanished before anyone could thank him. The clinic bell, rescued from a school, found a voice again. 3 notes at 07 wire, 2 at noon, 1 at closing. Neighborhood dogs learned the music. Before the district office did, data, if such a word can belong to a room that held its breath each hour, began to draw hope into lines. Dr. Sato's ledger marked fevers falling by day 3, stools firming by day 5, weight curves bending upward by day 7. Ellen's dose tally learned the names and weights by heart. Tanaka girl, 3.2 kilos. Watanabe boy, 2.8. Fuji twins, 2.5 and 2.6, and thrilled in silence when the pencil ticked higher. Reeves kept a column called Jiri, Ode, and on mornings when crates arrived light, walked to the depot with his ledger and refused to leave until the numbers balanced. A negotiator whose only weapon was stubbornness. Miyu's doorway school grew louder with tiny hiccups. The sound babies make when a full stomach protests in relief. Not every story ended clean. A cough can thicken in an hour. A fever can hide in a lullaby. 3 times the ward fell into the hush that follows a loss. And 3 times the chalkboard looked like an accusation, until Dr. Sato cleaned it with firm strokes and wrote new hours because grief, too, obeys schedules when there are other lives in the room. By March, nothing looked new, and that was the miracle. The clinic had become a calendar. Mothers carried its rhythm home. Fathers learned to boil water to the exact bead. Older siblings counted drops in the lamplight like little quartermasters. Penicillin and milk had soaked into habit. The city still ached, but the room breathed. This is the grammar from which the rest of our film will build. Human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral angles. all converging on the same verb, keep alive. With the routine established and the stakes written on faces and ledgers, the angles can now unfold. Care began in hands, rough with winter. Quick with fear, steady with practice. A mother's thumb testing the warmth of a bottle against her wrist. A grandmother's palm resting on a collarbone to feel the tiny seesaw of breath. Ellen's fingers counting radial beats while her eyes watched the color at the lips. Dr. Sato's knuckles pale where she held a stethoscope flat to a birdcage chest. Reeves cupping steam over a cup so it did not wander from a starving mouth. The room's currency was seconds. Feed between coughs. Lift before the rattle deepens. Wait for the swallow. Then the next. Women learned to share those seconds. They traded lullabies like recipes. Hummed scales to pace spoonfuls. Tucked hope into the rhythm of she, 2, 3, swallow. When a baby's eyes unfogged, someone always cried first in the corner where shadows gathered. The sound a body makes when it is allowed to stop bracing for news that doesn't arrive. Shame stood at the threshold some mornings. Pride folded its arms. Defeat said nothing. The doorway school met them all with instructions, not sermons. Wrap here. Lift here, count here. Nothing in the clinic asked for gratitude. It asked for attention. Mothers paid with everything they had. Time, patience, the hard honesty of admitting the milk was not enough at home. And then trust traveled. One bed to the next when an infant farted and the whole row laughed softly because laughter takes fewer calories than fear. The ledger showed gains. The faces showed relief. The hands learned a new religion. Do this, then breathe. Maps lay flat on a scarred desk. Not front lines, supply lines. Arrows from depot to lane. From lane to courtyard. From courtyard to crib. Dr. Sato gave the clinic a war plan with verbs for orders. Secure heat. Secure water. Secure time. Ellen ran rounds like a squad leader. Left flank fever beds, center respiratory, right flank nutrition. Swinging back on a 15-minute clock to check who held ground and who was slipping. Reeves handled logistics the way a sapper handles bridges. Test, brace, mark, move. The alley network became corridor warfare. Reeves walked the route at dawn, tapped doors that held babies, left dose tickets where fathers would find them at shift's end. A chalked arrow at a corner meant, milk here. 2 dots beside it meant penicillin in stock. When crates came short, a runner peeled off to the depot with a note stamped urgent for infants. The runner returned with a stubbornness that matched the stamp. Coal piles were ration points with guard shifts. Water barrels wore rope seals so no neighbor's need would become another's loss. Inside, discipline had the calm of routine. Bottles queued on a table like shells on a fuse line. Thermometers soaked in a mason jar like bayonets after drill. A kettle hissed at the same note every hour so Miyu could tell, from the doorway if the temperature was right. The night roster was written in pencil on the cabinet. Who watched the blue lip lane? Who walked the benches? Who had the cloak for the well run? When the clinic bell rang 3 notes at 7, the plan went live. It did not shout. It simply held the marvel was ordinary. A glass ampule. A loop of rubber. A steel needle that caught lamplight like a sliver of cold moon. Penicillin did not announce itself. It worked in quiet arguments with bacteria while mothers paced. Dr. Sato split the vials like a banker counting out salvation, units per kilogram, rounded with a mercy that favored the smallest. Ellen drew air out of bubbles and tapped syringes with a rhythm that sounded like patience. Allergies were the rare ambush. They had a counter plan ready. Cool cloths, alternate drugs, the sharp pencil mark Guomin on a card that would outlast fogged memory. Heat made the other miracles. Kettles that boiled, then settled to a breath. Double pots improvised from a broken sterilizer so bottles could float warm without scorching. Cloth wrap stitched from old yukata sleeves kept temperature at the skin, not in the air. Reeves built a bottle tree rack from crate staves and a bent nail. The pegs shone with pride from a dab of lamp black and spit. A hand-cranked sterilizer squealed like a bicycle. Its sound now equated with safety. The well pump took on weight in the mind, each stroke expressed in ounces saved. Technology here was not a headline. It was a grammar. Measure, warm, cleanse, inject, record. Tools gave the verbs edges. The thermometer set rules for when to feed and when to let sleep. The clock, a cheap pocket watch with a cracked face, turned doses into appointments that stood even when the wind hissed through lattice. No one doubted the machine because the machine performed and repeated. After a week of calm numbers, penicillin had a new name in the ward. The hush. The way a fever can fall and a room can exhale. These three angles. Hands, plans and tools built a platform the night would soon test. What holds in daylight must hold in shadows, when coughs climb and lamps flicker. Leadership in the ward did not look like speeches. It sounded like a list read in a calm voice. Dr. Sato's authority lived in sleeves rolled to the elbow and a pencil tucked behind her ear. She wrote orders as sequences, not commands: weigh, dose, warm, reweigh. If rash, stop. If lips pale, elevate. If cough persists, sling upright for 20 minutes and listen again. Ellen took that language and turned it into motion. She assigned corners, not titles. Miu owned the doorway school. Reeves owned heat, water, and the stubborn diplomacy of crates. The head woman owned the line. Each person's post was a place on the clock. Disputes came because fear is loud. A grandmother insisted on rice water. A father rejected needles and asked for prayers only. Leadership met them without friction. Dr. Sato demonstrated a stethoscope to a chest before and after a feed, a thermometer that read lower the next morning, the tiny curve in a ledger line that had no patience for opinion. Ellen made ritual out of consensus. She let every skeptical parent feel the bottle's temperature on their wrist. She allowed a single spoon of rice water after the milk, never before, so hunger did not bully the lungs. In the alley, Reeves bargained with depot clerks the way engineers bargain with steel. Apply steady pressure until the shape changes. The proof of this leadership was quiet stamina. No heroics, no drama, just systems that kept working when coal arrived late and wind pushed smoke sideways across beds. The list, short, repeatable, enforceable, outlasted upset. That is what authority did here. It turned care into policy, and policy into comfort you could set your watch by. The enemy had no face and every face. Pneumonia came as a hush. The pause between coughs growing longer until it broke like thin ice and the breath beneath it came up weak. Dysentery came as a drumbeat. Diapers changed too often, eyes losing their shine, fontanelles sinking like soft stones. Neither carried a flag. Both carried the clock. Delay 2 hours and a chest could fill. Miss a feed and a gut could quit. The ward learned to name attacks by sound. A papery cough meant steam and upright sling. A wet rattle meant penicillin at once if no rash, or a second-line drug if the pencil said Guomin. A thin whine before sleep meant calories now, not later. Mothers learned those sounds like sentries learned footsteps. They woke each other at the smallest wrong noise. Reeves mapped the enemy on a ledger. Cases per alley, water quality by pump, coal late equals more coughs tomorrow. He drew arrows from causes to beds with the bluntness of a soldier who doesn't believe in coincidence. Weather fought for the other side. Wind made heat leak. Snow made cues brittle. The enemy exploited distance, from depot to stove, from stove to bottle, from bottle to small, stubborn mouths. Leadership answered by cutting distance to pieces. Warm the room half by draft curtain. Shorten the queue with time tickets. Send milk runners to doorways where pride hesitated. A nurse's hand on a forehead and a mother's hand on a bottle formed a front line no map had space to print. Defeat rearranges the furniture of pride. Some mornings it made the doorway heavy. Men who had worn uniforms now carried buckets. Women who had carried families through fire now stood unsure, in front of strangers with needles. The clinic learned an ethic that fit the hour. Dignity first, then instruction. Ellen asked permission with her eyes. Dr. Sato narrated each step so consent had content. Reeves stacked the crate lids into a low bench because a mother should sit for the first feed after a long line. Miu tied privacy screens from old yukata cloth and taught newcomers that every body in this room would be addressed as Okasan or Ojusama, never as case. Mercy lived in measured ounces, not grand gestures. A spoon for a mouth that trembled, a longer pause between swallows for a baby who had forgotten how to want, a replacement dose when a rash demanded a change of plan, given without sighs that would read as blame. The moral work was done by repetition. When the bell rang, the door opened, the bottle warmed, the chart marked, the breath counted, and the sleep allowed. A different treaty was signed, one between strangers who agreed to share a rhythm for as long as it took to keep a child in the world. No one preached it. The room performed it. Mothers cried, yes, quietly, from relief as often as fear, because the body knows when it has been treated as something more than a problem. That knowledge turned cues into communities and schedules into trust. Hands, plans, tools, lists, enemies named, and dignity defended. These 6 angles built a scaffold sturdy enough to face a hard night. The test arrives with weather, with a cough that deepens, with power that flickers, with milk that risks cooling too soon. The night came in pieces. First the wind rising in alleys like a searching hand, then the power sagging to a dim smear and failing altogether. Last the coughs, not many but deeper, as if something cold had learned the map of the ward and was walking it bed by bed. Reeves lit the first lantern. Ellen lit the second. Dr. Sato struck a match and watched the flame bend, reading the draft like a chart. "Curtain down," she said, and Miyu's hands were already on the cords. The hanging sheet fell like a soft wall. The warm half of the room tightened its shoulders and held. The bell could not carry in darkness, so routine spoke for it. Blue Lip Lane to beds 1 to 4 nearest the stove. Fever Lane under the window, now curtained. Hungry but strong to the benches by the doorway school where the kettle's breath would not be wasted. The enemy announced itself with a sound Ellen had learned in field wards. Paper tearing very slowly inside a chest. She knelt beside the youngest, 2 months and light as a loaf, and counted. In pause out, long pause. Her hand hovered over a vial. "Allergy?" she asked. Miyu pinched the card in lamplight. "No mark." "Proceed," Dr. Sato said, already rolling back a sleeve and placing the stethoscope's coin on the little sternum. The needle slid. The hush that follows a shot felt like a held breath shared by 30 people. Outside, the wind threw grit against the lattice. Reeves checked the coal wall and swore softly. Dust, mostly. He dumped slack into the briquette mold, poured water from the well bucket, and pressed with his whole weight until the slurry became bricks. 1 to the stove. 1 to the spare. 1 more stacked like a pledge. Word arrived the way it does when fear runs faster than feet. 2 infants in the lane beyond the shrine. Not strong enough for the queue. Mothers too proud to ask and then too frightened not to. Reeves put on the coat with the worst patches, grabbed the milk can and a lantern, and disappeared into wind that tried to take the flame as a trophy. He walked with the can held like a compass, knuckles white on its handle, the milk line steady despite the gusts. He found the shrine lane by smell, incense and cold, and 2 shadows that separated into women when the light found them. "Clinic," he said in careful Japanese, and the word became a bridge. Back in the ward, Miyu turned the doorway school into a front line. She showed mothers how to sling babies upright across their chests so gravity could argue with fluid. She counted the seconds between coughs aloud so attention would pace itself and not shatter. She taught a grandmother with rice water instincts how to test bottle heat on her wrist and wait for the exact not hot, not warm that threatened neither gut nor lungs. The old woman cried, not from surrender but from the relief of being given a task she could master. Dr. Sato set the metronome, not a real one, just the clock in her head that struck quarters, and Ellen's body answered to it. Prepare, inject, count, listen. Prepare, inject, count, listen. The blue lip lane's color eased to plum, then to a pale that did not frighten the eye. On the fever benches, heads cooled under cloths soaked in well water, and squeezed tight against the coal stove lid for a warming touch that did not scald. Then the weak point found them. 2 cribs at the window end began to harmonize in a sound beyond coughing, a thin wheeze like a kettle running out of breath. "Vents," Sato said, and Ellen had hands under little shoulders lifting. "Steam tents," Miyu added, already tying cloth over bowls where water trembled just below boil. Reeves reappeared from the lane with both mothers in his wake, faces wind-burned and eyes wide. He slid the milk can to the table and set a brick in the stove with the tenderness of a man laying down a child. The room shrank to sequences. Ellen drew penicillin from glass that looked golden under lamplight and found the thread-blue vein. Dr. Sato listened and changed the angle of an elbow by 1 finger's width to ease a ribcage. Miyu counted spoonfuls on a whisper. Reeves pumped the well until his shoulders agreed to keep going and then returned to decant milk into lined bottles. His hands sure despite the cold. At midnight, the draft curtain trembled and a seam whispered apart. Cold slipped in with a confidence that could have cost them all the evening's gains. The headwoman arrived with 2 men and a spool of wire. No talk. The men stitched the curtain's edge to the ceiling beam while Ellen and Miyu held it up with broom handles and bodies. And Dr. Sato crouched between 2 cots with the stethoscope planted like a coin against winter. Reeves fed the stove until the flame caught like a stubborn heartbeat. 1 infant arched, eyes white-rimmed, lips bluing again. Ellen felt the weight of the vial in her hand and the weight of the night behind it. Do it, Sato said. Not to command, but to bring the team into a single verb. The dose went in. The wheeze steadied. The room exhaled as if it shared one pair of lungs. Miyu moved down the benches with a lesson she had saved for when hope needed scaffolding. Counted sways. She placed babies against their mothers' chests and showed how to sway to a set of numbers that matched the breath they wanted back. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Until tiny bodies remembered the rhythm. She hummed and the women hummed with her, an old folk melody that sounded like water poured carefully from cup to cup. By 2, the clinic smelled of hot metal and milk and wool. The doorway became a kind of customs booth where fear surrendered its contraband and received a stamped card. Penicillin at 0215. Milk at 0220. Breath checked at 0230. Reeves's ledger gained a new column. Written in pencil and not to be shown to anyone outside. Miracles we refuse to call miracles. At 3, the power flickered and returned with a tired buzz. The lamps dimmed but held. Dr. Sato circled the room once, twice, a third time. The third pass. She allowed herself a slow breath at the window where her face found itself in the glass and didn't startle. Ellen set down the last empty syringe, flexed fingers that had become claws and rubbed her eyes with the edge of a sleeve out of habit born intense. A small sound cut the rhythm. Not a cough, a sigh. The 2-month-old in bed 3, ribs that had counted the night, released a thread of breath that turned into sleep. The mother did not weep then. Her body went slack in the shoulders in a way that looks like sleep from a distance and like survival up close. Outside, wind unclenched from the lattice as if bored with a room that would not yield. Inside, the kettle's hiss sounded like someone shushing the night. The clock found 4. The metronome in Sato's head said hold. Dawn would choose its hour. The ward had chosen its stance. What came next began as steam along a row of bottles. As gray light finding the curve of cheeks that had been too sharp at midnight, as a line forming at the door before the bell had to speak at all. Dawn arrived as a negotiation. First, a charcoal smear at the window lattice, then a faint noise in the courtyard, broom on stone. Finally, steam walking the rim of bottles like sentries changing posts. Dr. Sato lowered the draft curtain halfway, letting the room test the morning. Breath counts held. The metronome in her head ticked slower. Ellen rinsed glass in boiled water that had cooled to polite warmth, then set syringes to dry on a cloth as white as anything the winter had allowed. Reeves checked the stove with a lover's patience and pressed 2 more briquettes into place. Miyu retied a scarf on a mother whose hair had come loose during counted sways, the small dignity restored as carefully as any dose. The first measure of victory was color. Not pink, that would be sentiment. The gray gave way to a tone with decisions in it. Lips forgot blue. Cheeks conceded a fraction, fingertips unclenched. The second measure was sound. Cough still came, but with endings. Less paper tearing, more cloth shaken out. The third measure was time. Intervals between alarms lengthened. A chart could be filled without the pencil breaking. Ellen leaned over bed 3, the 2-month-old with ribs like tally marks, and set 2 fingers beneath the nose. In pause, out pause, that didn't threaten, in again. She wrote a small plus beside respirations. The mother watched her face, not the card, and understood anyway. She exhaled a laugh so silent it looked like a shiver. Milk? Ellen asked with a tilt. The mother nodded once as if agreeing to a treaty. Reeves poured with the wrist remembered from 100 dawns. Tip, level, tip, stop. He shook 2 grains of AIM syrup into the enamel cup because mercy can be a spoonful and still be mercy. The bottle wore its cloth wrap like armor. Steam lifted in a dignified thread. Miyu took the infant upright, showed the angle that forgives a tired throat, and counted 6 swallows as if she were stepping stones across a river she had already crossed in the dark. Around the room, the night's small victories revealed their receipts. A grandmother who had argued for rice water touched the bottle's heat to her wrist and said nothing, which meant everything. The head woman, eyes rimmed with smoke, redrew the queue outside with a length of chalk the depot had thrown in with crates as if logistics had a sense of humor. 2 teenagers who had stood watch over the kettle during the hardest hours brought the hand-cranked sterilizer to heel until it sang like a bicycle freewheel. Out back, the monk cranked the pump because he believed in spirits and in flow, and the clinic needed both. The storm's last counterattack came from memory. A father in factory blue shouldered into the doorway, cheeks raw, eyes set for bad news that had lived behind his lids all night. He passed 3 women and stopped at the foot of a cot as if a guard had presented arms. He saw the color. He saw the breath. He bent at the waist in a bow that was not for anyone and for everyone. When he straightened, he set something on the table. An extra bottle tree, peg sanded smooth, varnished in lamp-black and care. "For tomorrow," he said, the words landing like a floor joist. Dr. Sato allowed herself 3 sentences to the room, each spoken as if they had always existed. "We will keep the curtain low this morning. We will dose on the hour for those marked. We will let sleep catch who can hold it. Orders, yes, but also permissions granted by a night answered." Ellen began the dawn round, a ceremony more than a patrol. She checked axilla temperatures and wrote numbers that argued successfully with the ones at midnight. She retucked blankets with a square that looked military and felt maternal. She replaced an empty bottle with a warm one by sliding it into a mother's palm the way a relay passes a baton. "You will finish this, and we will count it as a team." At the window end, she crouched by the wheezers who had needed steam tents and found the wheeze scaled down to a cat's purr, which is to say, manageable, watchable, not yet trusted but permitted to remain. Miyu took the chalkboard and erased only what the night had demanded. Jinji. Emergency from beside 3 names and wrote Zaiji Liang. 090, Riwei at 090 with a hand that made the characters look warmer than the room. Reeves opened his ledger to the column he had invented in the dark and drew a line beneath miracles we refuse to call miracles, not to close it but to make space for more entries. He added something else in small print. Owed 2 crates penicillin. Settled at depots 0610. Clerk agreed. The diplomacy of dawn. By 7, the clinic bell found its voice. 3 notes that bounced off brick and patched windows and returned as a promise kept. The courtyard assembled itself without crowding. Infants first, then follow-ups, then fathers with quiet faces holding dose tickets between thumb and forefinger as if they might smudge. The head woman moved like a conductor. 2 forward, 1 hold, 3 to the benches, and the line respected the baton. Penicillin worked its hush in the background. A thermometer rested its red line a degree lower than yesterday, and another half below the day before. Bottles returned to the tree with clean rims. The room learned the luxury of silence that is not fear. In that silence, a mother cried. Not loudly, not even visibly if you weren't looking. Her shoulders dropped a fraction and a tear took the long road along the jaw, so as not to disturb the child asleep against her. Ellen put a cloth in her hand without theatrics. Miyu tightened the sling knot with 1 practiced pull. Dr. Sato made a mark on the chart that said sleep allowed because sleep was now a friend, not a cliff. At 8, Reeves stepped outside with the empty can. The handles bite a truth he preferred to keep. The alley smelled of coal and cold and something like bread from a baker who had decided the morning was a fact. He paused at the chalk arrow he himself had drawn weeks ago, milk here, and smiled because the arrow had never pointed wrong. When he returned, 2 more crates waited by the door with a pencil note from the depot clerk for the infants who kept the night. He tucked the note into the ledger the way sailors keep charms. By 9, reways turned into increments, 2 ounces here, 3 there, a jump that looked like a misreading until confirmed by a second scale. Numbers are not sentimental, but they can be kind. The ledger's curves bent upward like small bridges. The turning point wasn't a single act. It was a sequence that held when it could have failed, a community that behaved like a machine whose parts respected one another. The night had presented its bill. The room paid with hours, heat, and hands. Dawn stamped the receipt. The camera can pull back now, through the curtained half-light, past the bottle tree with its dignified pegs, out into the courtyard where the queue is quiet, and onto the street where chalk arrows have become a language, to see what the night purchased for the week, the month, the season. What follows is the accounting, the ounces, the breaths, the schedules that returned and stayed, and the subtler balance sheets in hearts and streets that changed with them. The first ledger to change was the scale, not the paper one, though that would follow, but the creak and settle of the platform under a mother's careful step. Infants who had hovered under numbers began to nudge past them. 2 ounces in a week became 3. 3 became 5 when coughs receded and sleep stayed all night like a guest who finally knew he was welcome. Dr. Sato drew the curves higher with a pencil that needed sharpening twice as often. Ellen added a small star where breath had steadied by day 3. Nobody called them victories aloud. The room preferred proof to speeches. The second ledger lived on glass. Syringes returned unbroken. Bottles came back clean, rims wiped with the dignity of tableware. The hand-cranked sterilizer sang its strange bicycle song at the same hours, and its squeal came to mean safe. Reeves began keeping a side list titled Returns. Empties gathered from alleys, cloth wraps laundered and folded, dose cards brought back stained with milk and then used again because paper was a currency too. Consumption had become a circle. Routine spread sideways. The head woman took 2 doorway pupils and made them assistants with string wound badges so families could recognize authority without having to ask. The monk brought a second bucket and timed his pump rounds to the clinic bell, then drafted a boy from the temple to run milk slips to doorways where pride went mute. A factory foreman, unasked, shifted 3 men to early releases on nights when the queue ran long. For the infants, he wrote on a scrap, which passed as a policy once it was taped to the clinic door. Trust had a perimeter and it expanded. Fathers began stepping inside without hovering at the threshold. They learned to hold babies in the upright sling without looking as if they were carrying porcelain. Grandmothers arrived with recipes rewritten, rice water for mothers, not infants, barley porridge for siblings who had waited their turn in the cold. The doorway school became a forum where women compared the tempo of counted sways the way soldiers compare drill. There is a pride, they discovered, in the exactness that keeps a small chest moving. The district office noticed late and then officially. A clerk with a ruler measured the line in the courtyard and decided to call it a corridor. A policeman in a wool coat stood by the chalk arrow and directed foot traffic with 2 fingers and a nod, as if he had been born to this intersection. A permit appeared that no one had requested, protected humanitarian route 0700-1200, and was respected because paper can be a shield when stamped with the right ink. Reeves stopped having to argue at the depot every morning. He argued 3 mornings out of 5 instead, which was progress, and the ledger reflected it with a new column labeled 1. Numbers took on texture. The month closed with a count. Infants weighed, 86. Fevers down by day 2, 59. Coughs resolved by day 4, 41. Rashes flagged, 2. Alternate regimens successful, 2. Dr. Sato placed the ledger beside the kettle before she went home on a rare early evening and tapped the cover once, a habit she had developed when she wanted to praise without tempting luck. Miyu drew small circles around the names of mothers who had learned to teach, then added OK and kana because nothing fancy was needed to bless competence. Ellen wrote sleep aloud so often it became a line of music. Reeves added the depot clerk's name to the friends list at the back of the book and underlined it just once. Not every night behaved. A cold snap put frost on the lattice and pushed 2 cases back into the blue-lip lane. The draft curtain coughed at its seams. The clinic fell into sequence without having to speak it. The metronome held. The kettle obeyed. The wheeze bent to a purr by morning. The head woman, who had never sat during clinic hours, permitted herself a low stool by the door and accepted a cup of tea from the monk with the formal tilt of equals. The room learned it could ride out a setback and still keep the schedule's dignity intact. Stories drifted back from homes where the chalk arrows did not reach. A neighbor's baby in the next ward, a cousin across the canal. The clinic answered by exporting ritual. 2 bottle trees left with fathers who promised to teach a second doorway school in a borrowed bathhouse. A pair of teens took the hand-crank sterilizer's spare parts and assembled a twin from scrap. Dr. Sato photocopied dose tickets on a machine that groaned its age but obeyed, then tied the stacks with string and wrote lend on them because generosity on paper holds shape better than promises. By the end of the quarter, what had been a crisis began to read like a calendar. The bell at 070, the hush at 8:15 when the first penicillin wave settled, the rustle at 09 were for reways, the quick laughter at 10:30 when a line of hiccups rippled like a chorus. Ellen could tell the hour with her back turned, just by the room's sound. Dr. Sato retired the phrase Jinji to a lower corner of the board and replaced it with Shunhui, rounds, because patrol felt more accurate than alarm. Miyu drew a small milk drop beside the names of infants who had turned the corner. The board began to look like a constellation map of kept breath. The ledgers had something new to record, returns to ordinary. A mother brought in a baby for a routine check, not an emergency. A father asked if he could fix a hinge because it squeaked, not because it was broken. The monk rang his bell for a festival no one had thought to plan and declared that survival counted as occasion. These quiet victories demanded an accounting in hearts as much as in ounces. The next section will mark that ledger, what hope did to streets, to posture, to the way people answered each other's knocks. Hope traveled faster once it knew the route. It took the alley with the chalk arrow, crossed the canal on planks someone had planed smooth, and climbed a flight of stairs where a mother had tacked her dose ticket above a shrine, as if routine were a household god. The clinic felt the echo first in posture. People stood closer when they spoke. Fathers who had watched from the threshold now carried infants with the easy geometry of bodies accustomed to being trusted. Grandmothers arrived earlier and left later, volunteering for the dull work that keeps miracles possible. Folding cloths, rinsing glass, wiping benches one more time than needed. The neighborhood learned to anticipate. Stove wood arrived the night before a weather change. Buckets waited full at dawn so the first boil didn't waste minutes on a pump handle. The factory foreman formalized his scrap of paper into a rotation. 3 men released early on clinic-heavy mornings. 2 women granted late start after hard nights. A boy with a bicycle given a brass badge stamped runner, so he could thread traffic without being stopped. The badge mattered less than the permission it represented. The city accepted that an infant's breath could preempt a bureaucracy's clock. Rituals matured into institutions. The head woman's chalk and string badges became a roll book of volunteers with shifts and signatures. Reeves collated his ledgers into a 1-page map. District pumps rated by clarity and flow. Depot clerks rated by reliability. Lanes tagged with arrow symbols so a newcomer could learn the route before noon. Ellen wrote a 2-sheet guide titled If the Power Fails. Curtain, briquettes, steam tents, lantern placement, task grid, then translated it with Miyu into kana that any pair of tired eyes could parse at 3 a.m. Dr. Sato condensed months of taped notes into a protocol that would make sense to a clinic she might never see. Dose windows, allergy flags, the 3 measures of victory, color, sound, time, and the quiet law, sleep aloud when the breath writes its own rhythm. The tone of the ward changed. Children who had been patients became siblings with jobs. A girl of 7 learned to keep the sterilizer's crank in a narrow band of squeal that meant hot enough, not too hot. A boy of 10 became the master of cloth wraps, judged by the glisten of steam that escaped when he tied the final knot. Mothers spoke to each other with the authority of earned exactness. 3 swallows paused to smile, 3 more, and then laughed because joy had returned sheepishly at first and then with both hands open. On the street, dignity wore work clothes. Men in factory blue started bringing mended tools for the clinic. Hinges that no longer squeaked, pumps that leaked less, pegs sanded smooth for new bottle trees. A sign painter whose shop had no window and too much wind painted a board for the courtyard gate. Mu tozi, koko deshi o mamoru, mother and child breath guarded here. The sign did not keep anyone out. It reminded them to lower their voices when they stepped inside. Memory began keeping its own ledgers. The monk rang the bell in summer for a thanks without ceremony. Families brought rice balls and tea leaves and left them by the kettle without bowing too low. At New Year, the clinic closed 1 hour to let the floor be scrubbed to the wood and opened again to the first infant of the calendar, with a bottle warmed like a lucky charm. When the city thundered with parades a year later, the courtyard stayed quiet. The bell rang once and meant survive, then celebrate. Not every scar softened. 3 names lived under the corner of the chalkboard where Jinji had once stood. They were not erased. The room wrote fresh hours beside them every week as a kind of vow. Grief did not leave. It learned to stand without crippling the hands that fed and measured. The clinic's influence widened beyond what could be pointed to on foot. A bathhouse 3 wards away hung its own sign and borrowed the protocol. A midwife's room near the canal drew the chalk arrow on its step and learned the rhythm of counted sways. A depot clerk transferred to another district took Reeves's ledger habits with him and found himself arguing with a new foreman who eventually kept better hours. None of these were dramatic. All of them were contagious, years layered over the first winter like thin lacquer. The infants who had been weight curves on a page became toddlers with knees that found scabs and lungs that could cry for reasons less grave than breath. Mothers returned with second children and brought their own lists. Fathers nodded to the monk without embarrassment. The head woman retired her string badges and kept the roll book because paper remembers accurately when people are tired. Ellen rotated home and wrote letters on onion skin paper that smelled of coal smoke, long after the trunks were unpacked. Reeves shipped out and sent a parcel. A bright new bottle tree whittled on a deck under a different sky. Dr. Sato stayed and made the protocol ordinary enough to be ignored until somebody needed it at midnight. What changed, finally, was expectation. A neighborhood that had measured its survival in days began to plan in weeks again. Ounces became meals, meals became chores, chores became calendars. The clinic, once a refuge from disaster, turned into a place where families met before disaster, to ask simple questions about sleep and coughs and the correct temperature of a bottle. The room had always been small. Its future was large enough to hold a generation's first memory of rescue. All of this leads toward a quieter ground than numbers can name, a reflection on what mercy looks like when it is built from habits, why measured ounces can rewrite pride without breaking it, and how a night answered by hands can alter the shape of a city's future. History remembers banners and signatures, cities falling silent, ships turning for home, but survival is often written smaller, on chalk on glass in ounces poured with a steady wrist. The winter after surrender did not offer speeches that could be replayed. It offered a room where order became kindness, where repetition became hope. Penicillin was not an anthem. It was a hush. It slipped into blood while a kettle whispered, while a mother counted swallows against a pulse that had learned to hurry, and was finally allowed to slow. Warm milk was not sentiment. It was a decision. Calories converted into sleep, sleep converted into weight, weight converted into a future that could stand up and ask for bread without shaking. The clinic's triumph was not in a single rescue, but in a schedule kept when wind leaned on the door and coal arrived late. Defeat could have turned kindness into humiliation. It didn't, because dignity was made into a procedure. Ask permission. Explain the dose. Test the bottle on the wrist. Mark the chart with a word that means rest is safe. The ethic did not announce itself. It repeated itself until pride could breathe beside gratitude without flinching. That is how strangers become a team. That is how a neighborhood learns to trust a bell. Years will lay lacquer over memory. The bottle tree will stand in a corner no one thinks to dust. The sign at the gate will fade from black to gray. Children who once were counted in ounces will run down the alley shouting the same game in different shoes. But some mornings, when the air is cold enough to remember that winter, a mother will warm a cup with both hands and feel the old rhythm in her wrists. 3 swallows. Pause 3 swallows, and know that mercy still travels best by routine. War ends in public. Rescue is private. It sounds like a lantern set down without clatter. It looks like a pencil slowing as it writes sleep aloud. It feels like a breath you can finally stop counting. If there is a monument to nights like this, it is not bronze. It is a door that opens at 7 because the sign says it will. A kettle that hisses on time, and the quiet, ordinary fact that a city once learned to begin again with penicillin and warm milk.